The fourth meditation, subtitled Truth and Falsity, opens with the meditator reflecting on the ground he has covered so far, observing that all his certain knowledge, and in particular the most certain knowledge that God exists, comes from the intellect and not from the senses or the imagination. Now that he is certain of God's existence, a great deal more can follow. First, he knows that God would not deceive him, since the will to deceive is a sign of weakness or malice, and God's perfection would not allow it. Second, if God created him, God is responsible for his judgment, and so his faculty of judgment must be infallible so long as he uses it correctly. This is all well and good, the meditator reasons, but if God has endowed him with infallible judgment, how is it that he can be mistaken, as he undoubtedly is from time to time? He explains that he finds himself somewhere between God, a perfect, complete, and supreme being, and nothingness. He was created by a supreme and infinite being, and all created in him by that supreme being is infallible, but he was also created to be only a finite being. While he participates partly in the supreme being of God, he also participates partly in nothingness. When he is wrong, it is not the result of some faulty faculty created by God, but is rather the result of his non being, his lack of perfection. Everything that God has created is perfect, but God has created the meditator as a finite being whose finitude still leaves room for error. But the meditator remains unsatisfied. If God is a perfect creator, God should be able to create perfect beings. Surely, God could have willed it so that the meditator would never make errors, and God always wills what is best. The meditator reflects that God's motives and reasons are incomprehensible to finite beings such as himself. For this reason also, he rejects the search for final causes in physics, because it would require a great deal of arrogance to try to understand or read God's mind or his motives. Rather than look at one isolated part of the universe, the meditator suggests he might find perfection if he looks at God's creation as a whole. He may appear to be an imperfect being, the meditator, when considered on his own, but he may play a perfectly appropriate role in the wider context of a perfect universe. The meditator next looks at the source of his errors. They depend simultaneously upon the intellect and the will. The intellect, however, only allows us to perceive ideas, not to make judgments on them, and so in this strict sense, it cannot be the source of error. In contrast to the intellect, which he knows is limited, he reflects that he could not conceive of his will as being any greater or more perfect. In all his other mental faculties, memory, imagination, understanding, etc., the meditator realizes that God is endowed to a much greater degree than he is. But in freedom of choice or the will, the meditator realizes he is unlimited, and in this respect, more than any other, he resembles his creator. God's will may be greater in that it is accompanied by a greater knowledge and power, and that it ranges over everything, but when considering the will in the strict sense, the meditator concludes that his will is just as great as God's. Exercising the will consists simply in affirming or denying, pursuing or avoiding. The feeling of indifference is not a weakness in will, but rather a lack of knowledge of what is the true or right course to pursue. Thus, God's will is only superior to our own in that God has supreme knowledge and can always will what is good. Since the will is perfect and unlimited, it cannot be the source of error, according to Descartes. Similarly, since his understanding or intellect was created by God, it can never be wrong either. The meditator concludes that error results not from imperfections in either of these faculties, but from the fact that the will has a far wider scope than the understanding. As a result, the will often passes judgments on matters that are not fully understood and toward which it is indifferent. The meditator concludes that he cannot complain that God has created him imperfectly. It is only natural that he has a finite intellect, and the will is indivisible, so it cannot be anything less than complete. He cannot complain about the imperfections in him that lead to false judgment, since he is only a small part of God's larger creation, and his role in that creation is perfect, even if he may seem imperfect when considered alone. He concludes that he can also avoid error completely by suspending judgment in cases where he is uncertain and only passing judgments on clear and distinct perceptions.